It's the week ending Saturday the 19th of December, and this is the Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the Electoral College officially confirming Trump's defeat, 11,000 positive COVID tests going uncounted in Wales, thanks to a computer error, and the Duke and Duchess of Sussex signing a multi-million-pound podcast deal. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Kari, Wilkin. Arion McNicoll is back on the show too, and also it is the return of comedian and lecturer Abdul Tahhan. Starting us off this week is Arion. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is the issue of brain injury in rugby about to come to a head?
England have won the 2003 World Cup.
I don't really remember, the World Cup period. I can't even remember being in Australia. It was just watching someone else play, but looked like me.
It's Popham, who has not stopped running.
I had my diagnosis at the start of lockdown. We call it D-Day, Diagnosis Day. Ultimately, it's from my playing days. I didn't even realise that 90% of concussions are when you're not knocked out.
Alex Popham, and before that Steve Thompson talking to The Guardian this week about their experiences of head injuries during their days playing rugby. Arion, Steve Thompson saying there he can't remember playing in the 2003 World Cup final. That must be a devastating thing to admit.
I know, it's such a tragic story. And Steve Thompson is only 42 and he's been diagnosed with early onset dementia. He says that he can't remember he can't remember aspects of the games, but he also can't remember even flying to Australia to take part in the tournament. He can't remember anything about it.
So what's happened this week?
This week, a leading expert in concussion in sport has warned that professional rugby and actually football as well will both face huge litigation claims if their authorities don't do something about combating brain injury in sports. And Steve Thompson is part of this proposed lawsuit that's being led by 8 players against not just World Rugby, which is the game's governing body, but also the Rugby Football Union in England and Welsh Rugby Union, the governing body there, against them for their failure to protect all players, but them in particular, against the risks caused by concussion.
Yeah, okay, do something, but do what? I mean, what are they proposing is done?
First of all, they want some sort of financial compensation. There's quite some uncertainty about whether that's going to be successful, but their claim is pretty much to cover the medical bills that they're going to incur in taking care of them over the years ahead. But they also want to see changes made to the sport itself to protect players in the future.
Yeah, but like what? I mean, rugby does involve taking blows to the head.
I mean, that's a big question, actually, and there's a lot of speculation about if you start to tinker with the game, then how far do you have to go? How much risk is too much? How much damage is acceptable? But for example, some of the things that they're proposing are mandatory health checks every year, including brain scans for players, improved insurance compensations after retirement, and even, this one's interesting, limiting the amount of contact that players have just in training, because we know that, players play full-bloodedly even when they're training on the pitch. And one of the ideas is that if you don't learn to tackle properly when you're training, then you're not going to tackle properly in the game. So.
Okay, but Kari, how robust is the scientific evidence at the moment linking head injuries to early onset dementia anyway?
I mean, it's a very tricky thing to prove, isn't it? Causation and effects. There have been. It's not. This isn't just affecting football and rugby. I know we heard that there's going to be a spate, or experts are predicting a spate of further lawsuits involving this issue. But there have actually been players from various sports that have launched cases relating to what's called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE. There have been cases over in the US. the NFL, the National Football League, is currently actually has reached a settlement to pay $1 billion over 65 years in settlements to players because of the risks, because there've been enough of a proven link. But in terms of just scientific studies, in this country, a study last year found that footballers are 3.5 times more likely to die of neurodegenerative disease than their peers in the general population. Going back over to the US, there was a 2017 study of 111 deceased former NFL players that found 110 of them had CTE. So that's 99% were showing signs of this brain damage.
Yeah, I mean, when you get onto football, that's when it gets really interesting, isn't it, Abdul? And by football, I'm not talking about American football here, but the Premier League. I mean, you had that guy stretchered off the pitch in the game against Arsenal this week. There's talk of banning heading the ball, but do you think the Premier League would ever contemplate that?
Well, even if they contemplate that, well, let's face it, they get paid millions of pounds in order to play. So a little head injury here and there wouldn't really stop the Premier League to invest into making it more safe. After all, a lot of people, if you make it safe and put a lot of rules, this would change the game a lot. Maybe one thing that they can make is that when someone gets a head injury, they can pull them out, aside, and reassess them, just like what they do in the American football. You know, when someone gets a head injury, they get pulled aside, and that makes the game much more safer.
Well, it's interesting you should say that. There was actually an ex-World Rugby medical advisor, Barry O'Driscoll, has come forward this week, and he's highly critical of rugby's head injury assessment system, which is basically where they pull the players out of a game and examine them for 10 minutes to decide if they should then resume action. And he points out that symptoms of concussion may take up to 48 hours to appear. So these systems, obviously, it's good that they're all in place, but it's a Band-Aid.
And also CTE itself is an injury that seems to come about through a lot of small knocks rather than just concussions. And I think that that's been something that is only starting to be understood now, that originally they thought that being knocked out was the thing that caused most head injuries, but now we're realizing that it just can be a lot of repeated small injuries.
But then you wonder whose fault it is. I mean, personal responsibility has been a bit of a buzzword this week, hasn't it, for other reasons? But, you know, this may have sunk under the radar slightly in news terms, but, you know, the BBC did cover it extensively. The Guardian ran a whole series on it. So the argument would be now, presumably, okay, maybe the Rugby League has a responsibility for players in the past who they didn't protect adequately. But now if you go into professional rugby, you are aware of the risks. And it's just the same as a boxer stepping into the ring in that sense. You know you're going to get hit in the head. You take responsibility for that career decision.
I think there's something to that. And one of the aspects of the legal claim against rugby in particular that differs from NFL is that in NFL, the claim was partly based on the fact that the American Football League was doing its own testing into the amount of damage that was being done to players due to their head contact with one another, and then actively finding ways to bluff and cover up and suppress the voices of neuropathologists who were trying to give feedback on the damage being done by the sport. Whereas I think that rugby has been much more open about what dangers there are. Although even still, there's aspects that really haven't been well understood. For example, rugby players have been increasingly wearing these soft helmets that they hoped would protect them from exactly this sort of thing. But research today is discovering that, in fact, that protects the bone, it protects the skull, but it doesn't do a lot to protect the brain.
We talk about repercussions for all of us listening to this show when we discuss stories, and most of us aren't going to be professional rugby players. But a lot of us listening to this are parents. I wonder, Abdul, whether this gives you ammunition, on the school field to say, I don't want my kid playing rugby.
I used to play basketball when I was a high school student in Syria. I used to play for the basketball team of my school. Of course, we lost terribly every match. But even though my mom didn't want me to play to focus on my study, it was going bad anyway. But I wanted to play. I didn't really care. I was young. I knew the danger. But now growing up, I wouldn't stop my nephew or my niece from doing what they love doing for a number of reasons. First of all, if they're successful, they're going to be millionaires. So having a small injury here and there doesn't really hurt. You go to the office, sometimes you fall off and you break a leg or a hand. So, breaking your leg or your hand while you're pursuing your dream and getting paid millions to play, I think this is a good thing. I would love for my kids to be actually footballers.
Yeah, but rugby players don't earn millions, do they, Kari? So that is different, isn't it? I mean, that's one of the things that makes you feel so sorry for these players now, still in their early 40s, and, they're not living off massive pensions.
That's the thing. And I think, also going back to the whole kids issue, I think most parents aren't sort of thinking, oh, my kids will one day be a star in this sport. It's just like, it's dangerous. I don't want them doing it. And obviously, you don't know if your child has a skill in that sport until they actually start doing it. So this could have huge repercussions for the sport further down the line. But actually this week this has been major news. And this week we've also heard from 2014 World Cup winner Kat Merchant, who revealed that she's got lower cognitive capacity. Basically, she says she gets headaches and gets very flustered and forgets her words if she tries to do too many things at once. And she's not currently considering legal action, but what she is calling for is more support for retired players. And, more, whether that's medical screening, financial support, therapy. And so this is a major issue that even if you can't necessarily get rid of the root cause, you can't prevent these accidents or these injuries from happening, you can at least provide more support for players once they've retired.
It's also frequently, in Britain at least, Arion, a different class of player, and by class I literally mean the old, in the British sense, who plays rugby at school, isn't it? So, in America, you might say that you get into the NFL as a way of escaping poverty, funding your way through university or whatever. Whereas here, it's the public schools that play rugby. I mean, there's quite a lot of posh kids playing rugby. They don't need the money Abdul's talking about, but their parents will be concerned for their well-being.
Yeah, that's right. I think that people are doing it for the glory and the love of the game more than they are the money. But I think that it is worth considering the significance of the growing scientific consensus that this sort of game is causing this sort of injury, because the reality is that all kids, of course, they're going to say, well, I love doing it, and there's the prospect of glory and World Cups and all of that. And people do, when they're younger, have this sense of their own invincibility and invulnerability. But actually, even Steve Thompson came out saying, I just don't know if it was worth it. He won the World Cup. He got as far as you possibly can with this game. And even he is saying, actually, I don't think it was the thing that I should have been doing in hindsight.
All right, finally, just a prediction, Kari. What do you think is actually going to happen in rugby after this?
Well, in terms of this lawsuit, experts are saying that the players only have a 50% chance of winning because it's such a murky area and so hard to prove. On the other hand, it's not really in the sports interest to have lots of media interest if high profile sports stars are coming out and saying basically, I played this game and now I can't remember a thing. So I think they're probably going to reach a settlement, and obviously but if it costs the sport very dearly, then perhaps it will make other sports look at their own practices, you would hope, and try to protect their players.
Okay. Abdul, you're up next after this. Okay, Abdul, your turn. What is your story from this week?
Justice is served without French goods.
Verdicts in what had been billed as a trial for the history books nearly 6 years after the January 2015 attacks that targeted the cartoonists of Charlie Hebdo, a municipal police officer, and a Paris kosher supermarket. A range of guilty verdicts, the stiffest sentences going to the three tried in absentia, including the wife of hyper-cacher killer Amédi Koulibaly, Hayat Boumediene, guilty of financing terrorism and belonging to a criminal network.
Francois Picard reporting for France 24 on Wednesday about the conviction of 14 people over the Charlie Hebdo terror attacks back in 2015. And Abdul, none of those people were the killers, were they? They were all shot dead at the time.
None of these people were the killers. These were people who helped who helped the killers, who helped the terrorist attackers back in 2015. Some of their friends, 14 of them, 11 of them were present in the courtroom, and 3 of them were sentenced in absentia. Well, this is huge, and this is really big because the sentences range from 4 years to life in prison for some of them. And of course, some of them can still appeal this sentencing. But this is huge because this shows that justice will be served after some terror attacks. We've seen a lot of terror attacks where the attackers die and get killed immediately, and we don't see any justice. But for some reason, I think this gives hope that somehow those who were killed and affected will find some solace that seeing these people have been sentenced.
And I know this was the first terrorism trial to be filmed in France ever. And a lot of the victims' relatives wanted to record their testimony for posterity, basically, to show this was a really important moment for France. They want their feelings to be on the record, but they basically are still so affected by the pain of it, or they didn't really want to do it. I mean, France is still very scarred, isn't it, by the events of 6 years ago?
Well, it's still very scarred because it keeps happening. These cartoons keep resurfacing. We've seen a couple of months when the cartoons were published again, and there was a rage around the world. And then this started by a campaign in the Muslim countries to boycott the French goods with the hashtag on Twitter, and then a lot of people followed suit. I've seen a lot of markets in a number of Arabic countries decided to take away all the French goods and recall all the French goods from their markets. There was one case of a crazy person who burned his French car. I felt very bad for the French car. It's a very stupid decision. He could have sold it. Well, it just shows you that following hashtags sometimes is a very stupid thing to do.
And I mean, that strain, Kari, between France and the Muslim communities across Arabic countries, if that stays unresolved, you know, if it goes any further than a boycott of goods and remains a real strain, what could it lead to?
Well, I mean, over in France, we're already seeing Macron leading this huge crackdown on what he describes as radical Islamism. So, and that began in September, but it accelerated following the beheading of a Parisian school teacher in October after he showed his students cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, and this was seen as a revenge attack. And at the beginning of this month, Macron launched a series of raids on mosques and prayer halls across France, and all of France's more than 200,500 places of Muslim worship are going to be inspected. He's proposing laws to target separatists, which basically would include banning the importation of foreign-financed and trained imams, and tax breaks for mosques that sign a charter accepting French principles of secularism and democracy and the rule of law. So that will increase, but then presumably, you know, in response, Muslim countries are just going to, you know, up their game, up their response. So yeah, this could really accelerate and crash out of control very quickly.
Yeah, and that principle, Arion, of French secularism that is so firmly embedded in French society is almost a kind of fitting match, I suppose, for the feeling that Muslims feel about depicting the Prophet Muhammad. You know, French people feel as strongly about secularism in public life in a way that isn't actually the same maybe in Britain, for example, where we don't understand why they'd have such a reaction to, for example, the beheading of one person, horrible though it was.
Yes, I think that if you look at France's history of secularism, it really dates back to the Enlightenment, where it wasn't just a break with religiosity, but a really violent one with, you know, burning of churches and decapitating of priests and so on. So, you know, for many French people, and in fact, many people around the world, there was this idea that at least in the early days, secularism almost became the state religion. You know, it was called the cult of secularism, and it's being defended by the current president, Macron, so vehemently that it's almost become as much of an assault, if not an insult, like the cartoons themselves, to the Muslim population, which is extensive in France. At least 5 million people identify as Muslim within France. So there's this huge sector of society that feels that they're under attack from the very thing that France itself is trying to defend.
Where do you see this going, Abdul?
Well, I thought at the beginning this was going to last for just 1 week and then will disappear, because we've seen it before, boycotting the French products or the Danish products back in 2003 even.
And I should say as well, just as a point of fact, in terms of French products, I mean, one of the things being boycotted is Carrefour, which is a huge French supermarket chain operating in a lot of Arabic countries. It's not just about the products, it's about the place you're buying the products from as well.
It is. It is the places. It is the products. Even the products that have nothing to do with the cartoons, like cheese and any goods for like creams and things. So I thought it's not gonna last for over a week. My friends have already started doing it, and I thought that this was ridiculous. But this is their freedom, of course, to do whatever they want. But it's been now going for like 50 days. It hasn't stopped, and the hashtags are still appearing on social media and still ongoing. I don't think this is really realistic, but I've seen it coming from people who never bought, for example, Kari cheese. And they said, oh, we're not going to buy Kari cheese anymore. But they never bought it in the first place. So, but this is going even from people who've never really bought or used French products. But this is, I think, one of the most successful boycotting campaign I have ever seen.
Well, this is it. So the French reaction, Abdul, was originally to say that it was being pushed by a, quote, radical minority. Are your friends in a group of radical minority?
Well, I believe my friends are not radical minorities. A lot of them don't even pray 5 times a day, not even 3 times a day. So I don't think this is being pushed by radical minority. I think the problem was Macron's reaction to it. His reaction to it was completely different from the way people expected him to react. People, especially the Muslims, they thought that Macron would distance himself from the cartoons, would say, we have nothing to do with it. But instead, he said, these cartoons are French. But later, he gave an interview to Al Jazeera Arabic. He said that these are not the French government's reaction or opinions. This is the newspaper's opinion. So he distanced himself, but this was given to an interview in Arabic, not in French. So I think Macron has, these 2 different sides, one for the Arabs and what he tells them that we have nothing to do with it, and one for his French supporters says, no, we're proud of this. So I think this showed that to a lot of Muslims, not extremists, of course, not radical, that no, we're going to keep going, we're going to keep boycotting these goods, and we're not going to stop here.
I mean, it's hard to imagine what else he could have done, though, Kari, and I don't mean the inspections on mosques, which I realise have been criticised. I mean, before that, in terms of his statements, it's difficult to imagine, as a sort of centrist president, what he could do when you have a sizable minority of Muslims, as Arion was saying, but also thousands of people saying "Je suis Charlie" in the street.
I think his rhetoric has been fairly divisive, and this isn't just a social media campaign. Political leaders, including, Pakistan's Imran Khan, Turkey's foreign minister, and the Gulf Cooperation Council have all accused Macron of basically using this sort of divisive rhetoric for political gain. We've got France has got the 2022 presidential elections, and he's obviously going to have an eye on that. The right wing has quite a strong support base in France, so he can appeal to them while shoring up his own base by, with this show of strength. So I think he is, to some extent, using the situation for political gain.
But your point is a good one, Olly, that knowing how to respond, in particular to the Charlie Hebdo cartoons, if you're someone who regards yourself as a defender of free speech generally, is really quite complicated. Because on the one hand, of course, they're hugely offensive to Muslim people, but on the other hand, perhaps you do want to find a reason for all publications to be able to investigate and explore the sacred cows of any individual. But the question is this a case where it's gone too far? I think it's a really complicated one.
Also, this is, it seems glib to talk about this when so many people died as a result of it. I don't mean to be. But the cartoons themselves weren't very good, Abdul. I mean, that's the other thing, isn't it? Is that, if you were defending something that had a real satiric purpose, that was making a political point beyond, let's just, cajole Muslims, then you'd have more of an intellectual case that freedom of speech trumps the right to offend people. But it's just that the cartoons themselves, most people agree, probably shouldn't have been published in the first place.
Well, most of the cartoons were not really good. There were a lot of mistakes happening. But the problem is, nowadays, if you try to criticize some of these cartoons or the use of these cartoons, it's really problematic, and you would be seen as someone who is kind of radical, coming from radical minority. For example, I really felt very, very bad for Samuel Paty. He was an educator, he was a teacher. But for example, I would never bring things that would upset my students into my classroom. I'm a lecturer here in Hong Kong. I would never, there are a lot of things sensitive. I know they're very sensitive, and I cannot bring them to class. So yes, I understand these are very, very bad. cartoons, but also people should know better how not to use them and where to use them.
I suppose the problem is, Kari, that the rhetoric accelerates from the initial reaction of we won't give in to terrorism. Everyone can get behind we won't give in to terrorism. But then the reality is that actually more people do pause for thought now before mocking Islam these days than other Abrahamic faiths. And they do that because they're worried that there might be a reaction to that. So that kind of is giving in to terror. The net result is French people might feel that the terrorists did win. And it's quite hard to change the way they feel about that.
Well, I think that's one reason for the harsh, going back to the trial that we talked about at the beginning. That's why these sentences, some critics are saying, are very harsh. You know, some of these proven accomplices to the gunmen in the attacks 5 years ago, they got life in sentence. And some people are saying that basically they're being scapegoated, that the French people need something. They need to see someone paying for this. And, you know, and this can be seen as a show of striking back against terrorism, if nothing else.
Okay. Kari, you're going to give us something totally different after this. Okay, Kari, you're finishing the show this week. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
How can facial recognition help farmers bring home the bacon?
Message from Walker Keane, John Deere dealer.
Hey, Drew. Updated and checked your combines remotely. All machines are optimized for harvest season.
Message to Walker. That's great. Thanks. Send.
Message sent.
Kate, did you see the latest?
Looking at it now.
Dad's, worried.
With the solutions the agronomist sent me, he'll be better. How are the boys?
They're working where we can't, and they'll be on it all night.
They'll get it done.
A vision of the future provided by tractor manufacturer John Deere. The video is called Farm Forwards. You can watch it all on YouTube. Kari, what's this?
So Deere is basically one of many tech companies pioneering these tech projects which are associated with what's called precision agriculture, which, you know, is taking farming into the 21st century. And this week, this company Deere has announced that it will be piloting from next summer what it calls facial recognition for plants, which is basically it's using machine vision and machine learning to identify individual plants, and it will enable farm machines moving at up to 20 miles an hour to identify almost instantly where herbicides do and crucially do not need to be sprayed, which is going to reduce the use of chemicals and avoid killing plants that aren't genetically modified to survive these sprays.
So hold on, what happens at the moment? Farmers more indiscriminately spray everything in case they've got a particular weed.
Yeah, so you're getting herbicides going everywhere, killing plants. You know, aside from the crops that are actually designed to withstand these sprays, it's not just killing the weeds; it's killing everything around it. So this way would make farming a lot more productive and sustainable. And it's just one of these many amazing high tech solutions that are being found for farmers.
Ah, you're bringing us a trend.
Yeah. Oh, of course it's a trend.
What's the trend then? What else is happening?
Facial recognition is big in farming at the moment, actually. Over in China, which is the world's largest exporter of pork, millions of pigs are being identified and monitored with facial recognition technology. And it's to improve efficiency. Well, it improves efficiency in feeding and breeding, but more especially, it's also a good way to pick up on signs of sickness, which is really important in China at the moment because the country is recovering from outbreaks of African swine flu that led to the deaths of up to like 40% of the country's pigs. So it's a really, you know, some of these systems, they can monitor pulse rates and sweat and cough rates. And
Okay. So this all sounds like a good news story, Arion. You know, you can monitor individual pigs to make sure that animal welfare improves. You can monitor weeds so you're not indiscriminately spraying chemicals at the wrong thing. Give us the dark side.
Yeah. So to totally rain on your parade, Kari, the dark side of the story is that we've got an issue, of course, with food production if we're planning to try to feed everyone in the world. And, you know, if projections are correct and we're on track for having 10 billion people by 2050, then we're going to have to raise the amount of calories we produce every year by 7,400 tons. So there's this massive problem of food production that is potentially going to be met by the kinds of technologies that you're identifying. But I think most analysts see the flip side of the problem as being the major cause of that potential deficit. Specifically, we've all got to change the way we eat, and we've all got to be eating far fewer pigs, I'm afraid, and meat in general. And we've all got to change our diets in such a way that we're going to be able to produce enough food to feed those 10 billion people.
It's also, I suppose, Abdul, not necessarily good news for farmers. It's quite informative looking through the YouTube comments of the video that Kari just brought us on John Deere's YouTube channel, because obviously a lot of the subscribers to the channel work in agriculture. Here's a couple of sample comments. Please just make simple and affordable machines we can repair by ourselves. It looks like the years of sitting doing nothing but pushing buttons are coming. Prepare to be fat. And no matter how advanced farm technology gets, there will be some of us out there with equipment that's 30 to 60 years old. We will still be competitive because we don't have payments due to you, and we outwork the competition in hours and determination. I mean, there's a whole generation of farmers who chose to go into farming not because they wanted to sit as automatons behind expensive machinery, but because they want to get out there and plough the fields.
Well, these comments are made on YouTube, which is banned in China anyway. So these views do not really represent the farmers in China, right? So I'm sure in China they will find a lot of stuff, a lot of technology that's going to be cheaper and more affordable to a lot of people, just like when they did with the phones and everything here in China. However, this brings up the competition. Can people really compete with big companies? And is this really bad? This is not going to really help or solve the small businesses. Like we see I would love to open a university, but I cannot really afford to open a university. So I cannot really say, big universities should not employ professors because I'm not a professor. This is a thing, a good thing. Technology is a good thing. It's just about making it affordable. I think it's just by time.
Actually, going back to China, it is a major problem for small scale farmers there. Even the technology isn't affordable for them, and it is further. This is one of the downsides of it. It's further concentrating agricultural capital in the hands of a few. It's just turning it into a big business. Interestingly, in the 1980s and 90s, around 80% of pork eaten in China was from small farms. Now it's flipped the other way around. About 80% is from farms with 500 or more animals. So you're not going to get those small farmers in the same way. It is going to just be big commercial businesses.
And the point of those YouTube commenters, Kari, is that John Deere, and I'm sure other agricultural manufacturers as well, let's not just pick on them, make these huge tractors and big machines now that are effectively computers on wheels, so you can't service them yourself. You have to pay for the company to service them. And that makes your job harder as a small-scale farmer in many ways.
It does. But also, going back to those comments about, I don't want to just sit there and get fat pushing buttons. John Deere, it's taking the farming out of farming, if you like. They've just bought up in a recent US government auction, they bought a load of 5G licenses in 5 counties in Iowa and Illinois. And basically the aim is that in the future, rural areas will be hooked up to 5G and you can remotely, automatically control machines on farms from anywhere. So anyone can do it.
I think there's another big question about how you can actually roll these kinds of technologies out. And my wife's brother is a farmer down in Sussex, and he makes the point that not only is the average age of farmers in the UK 59, so they're already the sort of people who may not easily adopt new technologies, but also they don't have a lot of money. They don't have massive amounts of finances to invest in new technology, nor necessarily the inclination to change. So I think the tech rollout, even in a place where farming is comparatively high-tech versus the other parts of the world, is going to take a long, long time.
They may, though, at the age of 59, be in the age demographic to have voted for Brexit. And that is a cumbersome link, Kari, for me to segue into you finishing this story by telling us about the Green Industrial Revolution, which is something our Prime Minister is very fond of speaking about, that might be coming down the track.
Yeah, he just last month, he unveiled what he calls a snappily titled Environmental Land Management Scheme, which is basically, once we leave Brexit, we'll no longer be obliged to follow EU laws on farming. And he's planning what he calls the biggest policy shift in the farming sector in 50 years. And that will include all sorts of changes, subsidies for farmers to adopt greener ways of farming, but also more high-tech ways of farming. And actually, it also includes payoffs, basically lump sum exit payments to get rid of existing farmers and bringing in a whole new generation of more tech-savvy farmers. So yeah, I'd be very worried if I were one of those older farmers right now.
But they say, Abdul, that it will be more sustainable. I mean, that's the point of it. Is that something to cling on to if you're worried about, big farming coming along and taking away all the small farmers' land?
Well, I'm not really concerned about being sustainable or not, because all those big companies claim that they're more sustainable to make more profit and to make people feel better about consuming their goods anyway. That's what most of the big companies claim, that we are now using recyclable materials, we are now using green materials, we now employ refugees, using them as a tokenism. I don't buy it. For me, what I look the most when I'm buying pork or anything here, does it taste good? Is it delicious? Do I have enough budget for it? If yes, I'll take it home.
on that, I think it's time we take this episode home. That is it for this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to our very own journalist fertilizers, Kari, Arion, and Abdul. You can subscribe to this show for free via your podcast app of choice. Just search for The Week Unwrapped. No artificial intelligence required. We will be back next week with another edition of Culture Unwrapped as well. That drops on Tuesday. And then we return for the Year Unwrapped on December the 31st, you lucky thing. What a way to spend New Year's Eve. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer, Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. And until then, have a wonderful Christmas. Bye-bye.